I have a few quotes I want to share with you as we get going. I feel like it encapsulates well what it is we've been discussing on Sunday mornings. The first one you've been looking at and have probably read through a couple of times already. L. Whitney Clayton said, "Marriage is a gift from God to us. The quality of our marriages is a gift from us to Him." You think about that and what it is that we're learning. God has given us this wonderful blessing, this present of marriage. But the types of marriages we have really depend on our choices that we make with them and that we offer back and show our gratitude or maybe even lack thereof toward Him. Ezra Taft Benson, what's the secret to a happy marriage? Secret of a happy marriage is to serve God and each other. And that goes back to our triangle that we've had. It's probably a little flawed doing it with my hands. You get the picture anyway. Mathematically speaking, marriage is not a line segment. It's not just made up of 2 points. It is actually 3 line segments, and it's made up of 3 meet-up spots or 3 points. And with that, you have the man and the woman at the bottom, and at the top, the one who has brought them together and the one with whom an agreement, whether recognized or not, has been made, and that's God. We want our marriages to grow healthier and stronger. Well, as we're down here at the bottom and apart from one another, how do we make that work? We ascend to the common point at the top. We grow closer to God. And as we grow closer to God, then we grow closer to one another. All right, so does this mean we have these flawless people in these Christian marriages and nobody ever has a crossword with each other, and moms and dads are always smiling at each other, and kids, oh, parents, what do you want me to do today? How does this work exactly? Well, a happy marriage, and by the way, true of family also, but a happy marriage, I like this one, an anonymous quote, is the union of 2 good forgivers. And by the way, where have we learned the art of forgiving? Yeah, through God Himself. Now think about that. As individually we grow closer to God, we become better forgivers because that's who God is. And therefore we build stronger marriages. So it goes back to the previous thought. Look, the way God has dreamed this up is a beautiful thing, and we're not going to rehash everything we have, but I want to remind, go ahead and turn, if you will, to Matthew 19. Matthew 19. There's just one sliver of verse 9 that we didn't get to discuss. I want to make sure that we do that as we close things out today. But as you're going to Matthew 19, I'd like to remind, God has laid out the divine vision for a beautiful union. And for that matter, even family, if applicable. So what God's desire, what God's design, His viewpoint of marriage as well as family is this. You have a single man and you have a single woman eligible for marriage. He brings the two together and they enjoy life alongside one another. You have a husband who loves his wife. Really, I would say probably, when done correctly, unconditionally. Loves his wife absolutely to the fullest. Willing to sacrifice whatever it takes for her physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And then you have a wife who deeply respects her husband for the way he looks at her and treats her. And she follows the leading that he puts forth for that marriage and for the family. You have kids who with regularity, not perfection, but regularity obey mom and dad, even giving honor to them. And you have parents who recognize their role. Hey, we need to make sure that we teach the kids the right kinds of things. First of all, for their souls, and then secondly, even for their bodies and what they need in life to be able to succeed. When kids don't live up to standards that parents have laid down, they discipline them, but they don't abuse children, and they don't misuse the power and authority that God has given to them, and the kids grow to respect that. And over time, they don't just do what mom and dad says because they're scared to death of them, but they do what mom and dad says because they love them, and they don't want to disappoint them. Now, when we look at the Scriptures and lay that out in front of someone who's asked us, look, I'm having issues in my marriage or my family, have respect for you, for your family, and I know you're a Christian person. Can you help me here? What advice would you give? And we say, well, we don't have all the answers, but God does. And we show them this, and you lay out this vision of the Lord. How many people do you know are going to say, well, I don't like that. That doesn't sound like a good life to me. I mean, almost everybody's going to agree with any kind of moral compass and a longing for happiness, yeah, that would be the kind of life right there. But somewhere along the way, we people have messed up God's beautiful vision for marriage. We're flawed, unlike He, and we got this different vision of marriage. We started focusing on the wrong thing. Now, how does this section in Matthew 19 begin? Does anybody recall? Back in verse 3, with the Pharisees, they come to Jesus and they have a question about marriage, kind of. What's their question? It's really not about marriage itself. What's it about? Divorce. Hey, we want to talk about divorce. Well, that's the people's way of looking. That's you and me. That's the way we tend to look at things. Instead of focusing on the beauty of what God has laid out. And Jesus says, whoa, you're getting the cart here before the horse. Why don't we go back, an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure, and let's talk about what God really wants. And it's not about divorce at all. It's about marriage. It's just marriage, marriage, marriage. And so he lays out God's vision for marriage. Okay, and here's where we're going to pick up in verses 7 and 8, just as a refresher, and we'll get into the part of verse 9 that we didn't get to discuss last time. Verses 7 and 8, they said to him, okay, so they come to him, we want to talk about divorce. Jesus says, well, I want to talk about marriage, because that's God's desire. Notice how they switch the conversation again. Verse 7, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and to put her away? They don't want to talk about marriage. They want to do things the human's way. They just want to concentrate on divorce. So finally, Jesus says, okay, you want to talk about divorce? We'll talk about divorce from God's perspective. So he says to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted or allowed you to divorce your wives. By the way, the reference here is back to Deuteronomy 24 and the first 4 verses, if you're interested in reading that. I went back and looked through it just to make sure. Okay, want to just triple check here that I'm not off on anything. God never said, hey, even if such and such, some uncleanness is found in your spouse, and there's a debate to that. What's the uncleanness? I think it's pretty clear from New Testament teaching, it's sexual unfaithfulness. I don't believe the teaching from Old Testament to New is any different there. And so God understands, hey, look, in the human spirit, it's difficult to get over this greatest trespass, I guess you could say, or breach of confidence that could occur in this covenantal relationship. And if that's the case, okay, I recognize it's difficult to work through and overcome. He says, if and you, meaning if you decide to go this route, I will let you. But he never says, if this happens, you must put away your wife or your husband. That was never his desire, even in the case of infidelity. But he says, Moses, because of the hardness of the human spirit, and I believe another way of looking at that is because of our difficulty in forgiving, I think is what he's saying. Allowed or permitted you, but from the beginning, it was not so. God never wanted divorce with 2 people that he has joined together. And you're probably aware by now, if you've done it, Malachi 2:16, we're going to have a memory verse that's going to tell us God's disposition, his feelings on divorce. Okay, verse 9. So, what's Jesus teaching on this subject? Not God's first desire, but his allowance under the old covenant. We have so much of this in Christ's expounding. You have heard, it was taught, in the law it says, now I say to you, or here's New Testament teaching on the subject. Okay, so verse 9, our memory verse last time. And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, let's not forget here, and you might have fornication. Some translations are just unfaithfulness, if I'm not mistaken, or just immorality, excuse me. The word here in Greek is porneia, the meaning of which is unlawful sexual intercourse. So it's the sexual act itself in any way that's outside of what God has allowed, is what that is. Anything that violates his law. Except for unlawful sexual intercourse, and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries her who is divorced commits adultery. I want to talk, we didn't get to this part, to the last part of this verse that sometimes gets overlooked. I think it can help maybe to set aside the exception for just a moment, to talk about what the teaching is, and then in the end, toss back in the exception, I think it's maybe a little easier to understand that way. So let's do that. I want to give you an example. So, my wonderful wife, all right, so many excellent qualities about her. But one Sunday tells me, I think it's meaningless and a waste of time that you watch the Chiefs play football on Sundays. All right, there are a lot of things that I can take as a man, but that's where I draw the line. And I say, I can't live with a woman who disrespects my football team that way. And so I divorced Vanessa. 1 month later, I'm come across a real catch, pun intended. And this lady, she just loves football, loves the Chiefs. It's our whole life. And I said, okay, she's the one for me. And I marry her, and of course we have a relationship together. Okay, according to God's teaching, what am I doing now? I'm committing adultery. Okay, well, let's not forget what adultery is. It's sexual sin in which at least one of the two parties are married. In some cases, both are married, but not to one another. And I'm committing adultery against my wife because even though I have a legal slip of paper that has been given to her that says we're split up, there's some way in which we're still recognized to be married. And it's not by human law, because human law says we're not married anymore. The only other possibility is the one who joined us together. He still sees us as married because according to him, I never had a right to get a divorce in the first place. Even though I think my wife is completely bonkers about what it is she's told me, I don't have the right to divorce her. Okay, now let's look at the second half of the verse. And, so there's another party here that's involved. And whoever marries her who is divorced. Now, let's go back to some linguistics here. What do you see verb tense-wise? Well, similar, but what do you see, I should say, in the verbs that are slightly different from one another? The first one is divorces. Okay? Now, the second half of the verse is divorced. Those are similar. And it's not so much tense. Okay, let's not concentrate on that. That's not the concern right now. But what's the difference between the two? They're both action verbs, but I'm sorry. Very good. So I figured one of our moms would pick up on this. So used to teaching their kids grammar. That doesn't surprise me. Very good, Emily. So divorces is active. Is divorced is passive. And those are translated well. We have those in English just like they had them in Greek. And those are excellent translations. So the first one is, I'm the one who initiated, I'm the one who moved forward the divorce. The second one, in consideration of my wife, if I divorce my wife, she did not divorce me, but she is divorced because of what I did to her. The action has been done to her. She's not the one that's performed the action. Does that make sense? And the second part of the verse, this is what we haven't covered. Whoever marries her, my wife, Vanessa in this instance, who is divorced, I divorced her, and for a reason that I shouldn't, what's that person doing? Committing adultery, just like the other. She would be committing it just like the other. Now she could say, wait a minute, I have this slip of paper that says we're not married anymore. But God has this memory that says you are. Okay? So it's not the piece of paper that disjoins two. So the innocent party doesn't have a right to move on. The guilty party, the one of initiating the divorce, doesn't have the right to move on. The innocent party is what I was trying to say for the second one. The innocent party doesn't have the right to move on either. If this is on the grounds of anything other than what? Okay, of unlawful sexual sin, inclusive of adultery. Right, very good. All right, so we've established all of that. Now we need to go back and make sure we're understanding things properly. So whoever divorces his wife, in this case me, and marries another, commits adultery. Unless I had divorced her on the grounds of what God says in his law is unlawful sexual relations. Okay, if I'm innocent and my partner's guilty, then I have the right to do that. We often overlook this, but this is a big join sentence, maybe in your version also, separated by a semicolon. This exception modifies grammatically everything that's found in this sentence. So it's not just the first party, but it's also the second party that's modified by this exception. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Except what? If it's on the grounds of that other spouse's unlawful sexual relations. So the teaching simply is this. If I divorce Vanessa because she disrespects my football team, and I don't appreciate that, and that's where I draw the line, well, that's a bad choice, but that's a choice I could make. That's not going to lead to the best life, by the way, a worse life than what we had before. But if I make that decision, that is my decision, but I don't have the right to remarry, and in that spot, she doesn't have the right to remarry, okay? But if she has cheated on me, I have the right to put her away and to remarry. And with the second part of the verse, anyone who would marry Vanessa, it would be wrong if we were married first and that marriage has been annulled unless it's on the grounds of I was sexually unfaithful in that relationship to her. And then a person would have the right to remarry her. Okay, does that make sense in going through that? Yes, sir. Right. And he says the one you're with now, you've had 5 husbands, the one you're with now is not your husband. And she basically says, okay, yeah, you're right. Good. And we have some others that we'll discuss too. Very good, Roy. I think we'll match up with that. Okay, any other comments before we move on from this? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Sorry, by the way. Okay, good question. So for those who ask, I was hoping nobody would ask this one because this could take a while. I don't love the scenario, but I do think it's interesting to discuss, and it's something that's encountered all the time. So it's very important. Okay, so for those who might not have heard, Emily's question was this, and correct me if I'm off in this and restating it. So she says, in the example that I gave, I divorced Vanessa for a reason that I shouldn't disrespect my football team. But then I found somebody else and I remarried, right? And she says, okay, well, what about Vanessa in that spot? Because she's innocent in this matter. I think it's a powerful argument that can be made. I would say this: there's always a safe route to take, right? Okay, and a person would know that. But here's the deal: I would agree. It makes a lot of sense to me, the logic that's involved. So, even though there's a piece of paper that says we've divorced, obviously God does not recognize us as divorced, so He still sees us as married. So, if God still sees us as married, would God still not see my right to divorce that person and properly? I think there's an argument to be made there for sure. Again, I know there's a safe route that you can always take and stay celibate, no doubt about that, but I think it is logical as well, the reasoning. Yeah, good question. Okay, any other comments about that or any follow-up questions to it? Okay, so let's go to Matt. Thank you for that, Emily, and sorry for any confusion. I know for me it's a lot easier to, probably be better if I had a diagram for it. I don't know if you're that way too. Words a lot of times aren't as clear to me. But Matthew 5, let's look at that. We got to Matthew 5, but we didn't discuss this passage last time, verses 31 and 32. 31 and 32. I just want to reiterate, God's focus is, all right, let's talk about marriage. Great life. We often think, well, what about divorce? We get a little convoluted in the way that we approach things. Let's focus on marriage. Well, humans haven't always looked at things that way. We struggle with that. Verse 31 of Matthew 5, furthermore, it has been said, and this is going to be, by the way, Old Testament teaching. Deuteronomy 24 is consistently the case in the Sermon on the Mount. Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. In a roundabout way, you're going to find that in the Old Testament. It's not a command, but it's an allowance that is made. Verse 32, although the idea here is a lot of times are misinterpretations, misunderstandings of law, I wouldn't doubt that's probably the case in verse 31 when he says, but I say to you, Because it almost sounds like whoever divorces his wife, well, fine, if you want to, just write a piece of paper and it's done. Verse 32, that's not the way God looks at marriage. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, notice, for any reason, anything else, doesn't matter what it is, except sexual immorality. You might have fornication, unfaithfulness, or marital unfaithfulness. Same word there, porneia. Unlawful sexual intercourse. So it's a sexual act that is anything outside of what God allows. Causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. The teaching is largely the same here, but there's a little bit of difference in the two. I'm curious if anyone has under the part, this is New King James, causes her, that's a present tense verb, to commit adultery. Now, this is a little complicated, but this actually isn't a verb here. It's a verbal. You probably know this, and others too. I know you do. But a verbal is a verb form. So you use a form of a verb like commit. Usually that's used as a verb. But the way it's being used in grammar here, the part of speech actually isn't a verb, even though it's a verb form. It's being used as a noun and a direct object in particular. But it takes on a lot of qualities of verbs. It has action to it. It has tense, and that's the case here. Okay, so having said that, causes, present tense, her to commit, present tense, verbal. And so the meaning, as it's translated in KJV, is continues to cause her to continue to commit adultery. Okay, so let's go back and look at the teaching. I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality, okay, so outside of the exception, I'm divorcing Vanessa for a reason that I shouldn't. She's disrespected my football team, and that's wrong for any lady or male, by the way, just in case you're wondering. So, gender inclusive. No. So she's disrespected my football team. It's wrong for me, but I go ahead and divorce her anyway. So I am presently causing her to continue to commit adultery because she's innocent and I put her away. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? I think that's why some translations of Scripture, I want to give you an example. This one's the Contemporary English Version. And it reads, if you presently divorce her, you will cause her to be unfaithful. Like this is a future consideration. And some of our translations read that way to try to bridge the gap between the two. I don't believe that's the way it ought to be translated, and here's why. I want to go back to the original verb tenses. Causes, present verb tense in the original language. Very well translated. To commit in my text, present tense, CEV, Contemporary English Version, says future tense. Both of those are wrong. This is aorist tense in the original language, which is action that started and was completed in the past. It's done. It's not something that continues into the present. It's finished what has taken place. Simple past tense, same thing as ours in English. So essentially it would read this way when correctly and literally translated. Whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality continues to cause her to have committed adultery in the past. But that's like even more confusing than ever. But that's the verbiage that's employed. I believe the intended meaning is this. It's the only thing I found that makes any sense. Is not what she's caused actually to be, but what she's caused to appear to be. God's Word version translates it this way. Makes her look as though she has committed adultery. I think that's the meaning behind it. The human mind, whenever you see two people split up, especially in a nasty way, and I can't have anything to do with that person anymore. Naturally, what do you assume whenever you hear something like that? Well, I bet there's some infidelity that's being, and in the court of public opinion, she becomes guilty in people's minds, even though actually what makes a lot of sense is that in reality, she's completely innocent. She hasn't done anything wrong, at least not deserving of divorce. And I think that would make a lot of sense. I believe what God is saying here is that in an inferior life, the image that portrays is it taints people's reputation in a community. And that's one of the reasons he's not exactly overly fond of it. Speaking of which, let's go to Malachi 2, the very end of the Old Testament, not far from where we are in Matthew 5. Malachi 2, you know you have a memory verse coming up if you want to refresh just a little bit on that. Verse 16. We have a few statements before we get there. Verse 14 in Malachi 2. We're told that the Lord has been witness to these people between you, speaking to them, and the wife of your youth. What do you think is meant by the wife of a person's youth? It could be that, they're young when they get married. First wife, yeah, and a lot of times, especially in this culture, marriage happens at young ages. So he's saying, the Lord has been witness between you and your first spouse. Well, what's the significance of a person's first spouse? Well, we're getting there. With whom you have dealt treacherously. What does that word treacherously tell you? It's treacherous. What is it? Okay, if it is treacherous, you want to be careful, right? And the reason is it's dangerous. The meaning here is deceitfully, and that is dangerous to treat somebody that way in a lying method. Okay, keep that in mind. Yet she, first wife, is your companion. Now, I find that interesting because this context, you get down to verse 16, our memory verse, we're talking about divorce. Divorce has taken place, right? Undoubtedly, why is this conversation happening otherwise? So, people are dealing deceitfully with one another's spouses, with their first spouses, and he says, be careful not to deal deceitfully, divorce. Notice in verse 14 what we just read, yet, for this reason, she is. That's presently. She is still your companion. And the reason is she is your wife by covenant. We'll come back to that. Verse 15, but did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? I believe that's of himself. And why one? Kids are in this conversation. He seeks godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously, dangerously, or deceitfully with the wife of his youth or the person's first spouse. Here's the Lord's feelings on divorce. Who would like to say it? Malachi 2:16. Very good. Sounds like you see this in the same light I do. It's a little, the chunks of it are, yeah. So, but here's what we're told. The Lord, and there's a context to this, and we'll bring this full circle by the time we're done here this morning. There's a context to this teaching, the Lord hates divorce. I don't want to get into that right now, though. We're going to table it. Okay, so divorce, the Lord hates it. Why does he hate this divorce that's spoken of in this context? I'd like to go back to verse 14. Because the Lord has witnessed deceit, and the Lord hates deceit. He hates lying. Well, when divorce happens, why is there deceit that has taken place? Every time, every divorce, there's some deceit somewhere. It may be one party that's guilty. It may be both parties who are guilty of it. How did this marriage form in the first place? What constitutes a marriage? God's standard, it's his idea, so let's let him define it. What's a marriage? Okay, you have one man, one woman, eligible for marriage, by the way, who are joined together. How do they get joined together? Who helps them? Okay, all right. So, and he mentions this is a covenant, or this is an agreement. This is a geometric shape upon which we have agreed. And remember, it's not a line segment upon which we've agreed. We have agreed to, my poorly formed one by my hands, but a triangle. We have agreed to this. You have the man, and you have the woman, and at the top you have God. It's not just the man and woman who have agreed together to live life together, the fullness of life, to keep themselves for one another and completely just to one another. And God says, all right, I agree with you. And he brings them together. And so the promise has been made to each other, and the promise has been made to God. you realize the only way a divorce can happen is if there's lying involved. The only way. Because you have two people who have agreed to live together, to keep themselves to one another, only to one another for the entirety of their lives, and they promise this not just to each other, but as well to God. And there's a breach of contract if a divorce happens. At least one party is wrong and has dealt deceitfully with the other. Now, sometimes both parties have been deceitful toward one another. What is God's feeling toward lying? Proverbs 6:16 through 19, these 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to them. A lying tongue, a false witness who speaks lies. Did you notice the terminology in verse 14? God's upset with these divorces because he has been witness. Someone has falsified information here. And that's something that he hates. Divorce can't happen unless at least one party has dealt deceitfully. That's why God hates it, because he hates lying. She is presently your companion, because even if you say, okay, well, I'm not going to live by the standard I said I would anymore. Well, you said you would, and you swore to God that you would do such a thing. You gave your word. So she is still, you're still joined in this agreement. Your companion and your wife by covenant understood. Let's not make sure we cast this to the side. Deuteronomy 24, Old Testament. Matthew 5, Matthew 19, New Testament, with one exception, right, that God allows in the case of marital unfaithfulness, and then he allows. By the way, which also I think makes a lot of sense. If it's not God's number one desire, why would he allow divorce even though he hates it in that circumstance? If someone is sexually unfaithful in the marriage bond, why would he allow that? The whole point of marriage is two people saying, I promise I will keep myself to you and to you alone. That is a lie, if it's, or at least it's falsified information in the witness. If a person breaks that word, a person breaks the vow, and in God's sight, I believe it makes a lot of sense. A person has broken the commitment. There's a breach of contract. Well, in a contract, if one side breaches the contract, guess what that does to the contract? Legally, it gives the potential of the nullifying of it. And I think that's why God, in his judicial sense, allows it for that reason, because it's a breach of contract. So, continuing on, but did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? I think this is a reference to the Holy Spirit. And he's saying that God has gotten involved in bringing you together. He's given you a piece of himself and his blessing on this union. But then he continues this, and why one? He has made them one. Now, do you recall the geometric shape? In marriage, how do we grow closer together to become one in every way? And I know there's, of course, the one on the physical side of things, the two flesh becoming one flesh. But in a higher and greater sense, how do the two become one? They have to ascend those tops, each one. And as the two grow closer to God, they grow closer to one another. Why has he made them one? So that they will not only be married, but as well be and have a godly marriage. And then look at the result if and when they have children. He seeks what kind of offspring? What kind? Godly offspring. He wants us in our marriages to grow closer to God. As we grow closer to God and we have kids, and you have this strong godly force, a male and a female presence in that home, 100% for God, guess what the likelihood is for that child? The kid still has a choice, okay? But you look up the statistics on a child that grows up in a strong Christian home compared to a child that has no Christian upbringing whatsoever, and it's astronomical, the difference. That doesn't mean that a child can never choose what's right. If he or she's put at every disadvantage, it still can and sometimes does happen, but it's very rare. That, compared to a strong Christian home, typically produces Christian children. But the point of which is this. God says in this marriage and what's happening, he hates divorce. He hates it because there's some kind of breach of contract, falsehood, lying that's gone on, and he hates lying. but also he starts considering the kids. How often when divorce is being considered, the two parties just sit down and say, okay, well, wait a minute, what's the best thing for our kids? Usually it's, as I introduced, well, I'm not happy and I don't know that I'm ever going to be in this relationship. And don't misunderstand, happiness and personal happiness will tie in. That's a very important thing. But we need to consider other people that are involved. What does it do to the kids? Our society is a complete mess. It's been said for many years, and so true, maybe since the dawn of time, that as goes the family, so goes the nation. As goes the family, so goes the world. As goes the family, so goes the church. And we see this on a regular basis. The importance of having a strong family is the importance of having a strong community, the importance of having a strong nation, the importance of having a strong world, the importance of having a strong church. It all starts with having a strong family. In our inner cities, we see, of course, prisons that are just overrun, and many of whom are, 18 to 25-year-olds who never had any discipline. Is it a coincidence that you go back and you look at those households statistically, it's a rarity that they ever had a male presence in those homes? People who are desensitized and have no feeling of any kind, a lot of them never had the nurturing at home that they needed from a strong, godly female presence. So many of the struggles that we have with sexual orientation and so-called gender confusion, and now it's, I guess it's animal confusion. I don't know what the proper term for it. You think you're a kitty cat and you got to go to the bathroom and a litter box whenever at school and these kinds of things. I encourage you, just of situations of these like these that go back and contemplate, if you know the families at all or the individuals, how many of them had a strong male and female presence with two people that are committed together for life. Most of these, they never had a mom, they've never had a dad, they've never had a family, and they don't know what it's like. And are there some that still go through that who have? Yeah, but it's rare, and it's the exception. Just look at the instances of which you're aware. God says, I hate divorce of two people I've joined together because someone has lied. Maybe both parties have lied, and I hate lying. Yes, I do allow it in one situation, but I hate it for that reason, and I hate it for what it does to the kids. I want godly kids, but if we have broken homes, God is saying, the odds aren't good that a kid's going to come out loving and serving me. Children need to be taken into the conversation. All right, so these things that we've discussed, God's vision for marriage and for the family, you're not going to find hardly anyone who's going to look at that and say, oh, that's awful, I don't want that. Anybody who has any sense of morality and a care for God in the least is going to want that kind of life. But I think it's helpful biblically to lay out, or we could have this. We could split up, and whenever we do that, people could look down on us. Our families could be have animosity toward one another. Our kids are going to be put at a disadvantage and might not even be able to identify any longer how God made them to live in this world, and be confused, not have the discipline and the skills that they need for life. Which one of these two? Well, these are the two visions. It's God's vision and it's people's vision. And then encourage the individual. And I think this is key. Listen, our purpose in life isn't to browbeat people with the gospel. It's simply to let people know, hey, these are two options that God lays in front of us. We could have the best life, we could have an inferior life, and He's not going to make us choose either one, but He leaves us to make the choice which kind of life we want. Now, there is a childish way of looking at this and an immature way. Go back to Matthew 19. Matthew 19, verses 10 through 12. So Christ has provided His teaching. And in verse 10, His disciples said to Him, if such is the case of the man with the woman, with his wife, well, it's better not even to marry. All right, so they come in asking Him about divorce, talking about the worst life. Why have a bad life at all? God says, let's have a good life. Jesus says, let's talk about marriage. No, we want to talk about divorce. Okay, well, here's God's allowance, but it's still not what He wants because it doesn't provide the best life. It's an inferior life. Well, if that's the way God looks at it, I don't even want to get married then. why are these people marrying in this time? Obviously, from the disciples' response. Now, these are the good people, by the way. The disciples' response. Why are they marrying? There you go. It's not about because they love someone and they want to sacrifice and they want to be together for life. They're essentially marrying so they can divorce, and then they can marry so they can divorce, so they can marry and then they can divorce. They just want to do this endlessly, and it's all based on selfishness. Jesus said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it is given. There are two ways interpreting verse 3. I'm going to hit the fast version of this for time's sake. He says, there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb. I'll just state this. You could look at it physically, or you could look at it figuratively. You go back to verse 10 that leads into this instruction. I think he intends for this to be figurative in its interpretation, but it may be physical. Both match. There are eunuchs who are born thus from their mother's womb. In other words, there are some who never enter into marriage. We don't have any record of Paul becoming married, some say, because of his affiliation with the Sanhedrin, maybe. Okay, whatever. We know through his ministry he wasn't. He says, I wish all people personally were as I am. But he says, different people have different gifts. I don't have to be married. I don't have to be intimate. And, I'm okay just to abstain from that. Some people choose that life. And, of course, this marriage teaching wouldn't apply to them, Jesus is saying. And there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. Okay, or people who can't be intimate because they're forced into that. Or figuratively, it could be saying that there's been an unlawful divorce, and because the unlawful divorce is taking place, maybe the spouse has remained celibate in that, doesn't have the right to remarry, is what he might be saying. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. In other words, people who understand I'm an ineligible partner by God's standard for marriage, and so instead of being with a partner here for a few decades, I want to be with my partner God forever in heaven. And so that's the decision I make. I'm not going to get married or perhaps remarried. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. He says this is God's standard, and here are the results from that, and these are the options that are available. I want to close just in a couple of passages. Malachi 2. Let's go back to that spot. The few minutes we have ought to be enough to wind things up. Malachi 2, verses 13 and 14. And this is the second thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with crying. That doesn't sound like a very enjoyable life, does it? Look at the context of why this is going on. Verse 10. We profane the covenant of our fathers. Judah has dealt treacherously. Profane the Lord's holy institution involving marriage. Verse 16, we're talking about divorce. When divorce happens, have you ever known of one taking place without any tears, without any weeping, without any crying? Yes, sir. Right.
He gets married. They may have kids, they may not.
Right.
So that's an illegitimate marriage, right?
Yeah, correct.
Does God expect that person to get a divorce from that marriage?
Perfect. Perfect lead in. Okay.
Okay.
I'm actually going there. Thank you. No, it's excellent. I don't know if it's great minds or misery-loving company, but we're on the same page. Thank you, Shane. Excellent. All right, so hang on to that. Hang on to it. Life is inferior, weeping, tears, and crying, coming to the Lord. But he says, I don't regard your offering anymore. Your worship has been impeded because something's off in our relationship. And here's why. He who does not love his brother, how can he not love God, right? Made in the same image. And what he's saying is, because of your relationships here and you're not meeting your duty with those relationships, it's messed up our relationship together. That's how important the marriage relationship is. Verse 14, yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been witness in what you've done with your spouse, the wife of your youth. You've dealt treacherously, dangerously, deceitfully, because she still is, even though you've given her the piece of paper that says not, your companion and your wife by covenant. You ought to be together. Again, we've laid out these two options. It's left to us to decide, which life do we want? What God tells us, hey, this is my vision because this is the best life, or do we want people's vision and we think it's better, but we're going to find out in the end that God really knows what's best? What advice should we give people? My simple advice would be, even though it's our choice, I would always encourage, enact God's vision, live it out. It's going to lead to the best life. there's any way possible, with two people who are eligible to be married with one another, stay together, God has brought you together, that's what God wants. Now, if there is infidelity, yes, He does allow divorce, and a person can still be right. A person who's innocent in that can still move on with somebody else. But I would always encourage what God's vision is. If there's any way, even with infidelity, stay together and work things out. Okay, so Shane brought this up. We're going to close on this one. Well, what about if there are two people that God hasn't brought together that are married? Because we read in Malachi 2, verse 16, God hates divorce. Hang on just a second. What's the context of the divorce that He hates in Malachi 2? What kind of marriages are found there? The original marriage of two eligible people that He has brought together. That's the context. It's not that He hates divorce in every circumstance, but He hates it with two people that He's brought together. Let's close on this. Ezra chapter 10. Now, I realize under the Old Testament there were some marriage standards that are slightly different than ours. Namely, they couldn't marry Canaanites. I don't believe that it's wrong to marry a descendant of a Canaanite today. Okay, that's a different law, but that's what the people had done. They had violated God's marriage standards. So let's look in the final chapter of Ezra to see what are people supposed to do in this scenario. Verse 1. Now, while Ezra, the priest, was praying, and while he was confessing, weeping, bowing down before the house of God, a very large assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him from Israel, for the people wept very bitterly. It's not just the males, it's not just the females, it's the kids. These families are torn apart emotionally. What do you think might be going on here? Violation of God's marriage standards. And Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, spoke up and said to Ezra, "We have trespassed against our God and have taken pagan wives from the peoples of the land," violated God's marriage standards. "Yet now there is hope in Israel in spite of this." There's a way to fix this. How is it? Verse 3. "Now therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away or divorce all these wives and those who have been born to them according to the advice of my master and those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law." I would be very careful in giving marital advice when people ask it of us and saying, no matter what, God wants two married people to stay together and work it out. That's not always the case. That's if there are two partners who are eligible for marriage that He has joined together. But if the marriage law has been violated, and really this isn't a marriage, even though a piece of paper says it is because it does not stick to God's standard, what's the way of fixing it according to God's advice? It would actually be through the annulment of that relationship so that the sinful lifestyle of adultery does not continue. So, hopefully that's answering of your question. Okay, I know. Sorry for this taking so long, but there's a lot here. I knew it would take at least 2 class periods. I'm not surprised that it took 3, but I'm glad hopefully we got through. If there are any questions that remain, we're totally out of time, but if there are any questions that remain, any comments, please know that you can come talk to me about it, whether it's advice or anything else, and I'd be glad to do that, and I understand we can't cover it all in this setting. But the short of which is this, going back to the original question, doesn't God want me to be happy bridging the gap? Absolutely. God wants all of us to be happy. It's just that He's not really concerned about our being happy for a few decades here on earth. He's much more concerned about being happy with Him in heaven forever and living by His standards. Okay, appreciate all the comments and the questions that were brought in. Again, feel free to ask me if there are any more afterward we didn't have time to cover. Next time, our last speech season with SALT class is going to be on if somebody inquires of us, do you believe in the rapture? And do you think the rapture is close? How do we respond to that? And in a unifying way. 1 Thessalonians 4:17, memory verse. 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Thanks for staying over.